Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to look at some important issues that are really useful for you as you go on to be a professional in digital content creation. So we're thinking about the industry context of copyright, ethics and critics. Before we get started, just a friendly reminder that if this is your your last semester at the college, that you need to ensure that you submit your degree preference for SP5 2020. There's information in your emails about how to do this if you're in this position, and congratulations for coming to the end of your program. Now, let's get into the content for this week's lecture. In today's lecture, we're going to look at some key areas: ethics, copyright, commons-based peer production, ethical strategies, documentary and truth, and then there's a screening. And essentially what we're doing here is we're thinking about those issues you often see depicted in cartoons where we have an internal tussle between what is the right thing to do, the devil and the angel on your shoulder as it's referred to in ancient times, or perhaps in The Simpsons. I think this cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes really captures some of the reasons why we want to work as ethical content producers. As Calvin says in the second line, I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue over whether it's right or not. Hey, why'd you do that? Hobbes says, you were in my way. Now you're not. The ends justify the means. Calvin says, I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me. So here we see some of the issues if we think about ethics in a really selfish and individualistic way, as Calvin has here. It's more about what's for the greater good and what's for the benefit of society. There will be some confronting examples today, which are appropriate for university learning, but if you do find that there are any issues, you are free to leave at any stage and welcome to come to the consult to discuss the examples. I hope that you'll find them useful as ways to explore these ideas. So what's the difference between ethics and morals? Well, in the definition, ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or the conducting of an activity, and it's the branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles. Sometimes ethics are actually put out as particular statements for people working in a specific area. Morals are concerned with the principles of right and wrong behaviour, the moral dimensions of medical intervention, or a moral judgment. So we're trying to work out what's right and wrong and what works to help keep society going in a positive direction. So you can reflect on the cartoon. Do you agree with Calvin? Do the ends justify the means? This is a still from the film Bruno, which is a Sacha Baron Cohen film. And as in many of his works, things like Borat and other films, he's playing a specific character. And he uses this as a way to kind of unpack some of the issues that might underlie the way people operate in broader society. So I've included a link there to the hottest baby photo shoot. What's interesting with the ethics that are being explored here, the character Bruno is essentially seeing what parents would be willing to have their small children do for the purposes of fame. So he's essentially pushing their boundaries, and the parents of these little babies, because they're the kind of so desperate for fame, are agreeing to these things for their children. So an interesting example there of ethics, and we can question what's going on there and who is the most problematic ethically. A lot of his work often acts to highlight those sorts of things through humour. You can see this week's readings for further examples of truth and ethics in public contexts, and this week's reading is written particularly from the perspective of public relations practitioners who are often responsible for representing clients in specific domains. It's useful for us to think about as digital content creators. We can reflect on the role of representation, and there are some really helpful case studies for thinking through these issues. Of particular benefit is the case study 45, which is looking at animals in captivity, the documentary Blackfish and the response from SeaWorld. Ethical approaches. I love this cartoon because it highlights this idea that with great power comes great responsibility, as we know from Spider-Man, and also as something we need to remember as digital content producers. So, firstly, in terms of ethical approaches, you should research to ensure fair representation. Consider the politics of representation, the use of language and imagery. Be open minded and listen to diverse opinions. Be aware of your power as a digital media maker. And a really helpful way to do this is to reflect on how would I feel if someone treated my little sibling like this, or my grandparent, someone who might be in a less powerful position. Respect your topic and talent. They're giving you the time to be engaged with your project, so be respectful in the way that you use their imagery and the content that they've provided you with. Also, respect your audience. Provide them with relevant information, but don't necessarily be didactic and tell them to make their minds up a certain way. Be aware of specific protocols designed to ensure that work is respectful towards diverse groups, such as Aboriginal Australians. Maintain an industry code of conduct. For example, at UniSA, there's a specific code of conduct. Things like the media, the MEAA, so Media Arts Alliance. I meant to blink on the E, but you can look it up. As they have a specific ethics statement for people working in the media in Australia. So you can see this information is available out there online. Maintain legal and moral approaches to the way you do things, and that way you will ensure a good professional reputation. Aim to avoid emotive representations, so try to work with logic and evidence rather than pulling on emotional drawstrings, emotional heartstrings. Strive for a balanced and fair representation of the topic. If you're doing all of these things, this will help you to maintain good production ethics. And work in ways that demonstrate your integrity. Copyright is really important for everyone that creates new things to be aware of. Copyright works to provide creators with an incentive to create new works and a legal framework for the control of their creations. Copyright protection is free and it applies automatically when material is created. There is no registration system for copyright in Australia. The copyright notice does not need to be on something to ensure that it is protected by copyright in Australia or most other countries. But it does remind people that the work may be protected. It also lets people know who is claiming copyright and is the presumed copyright owner. So it's good practice, even though it's not legally required, it's good practice for you to assert your ownership through using the copyright symbol. As noted by the Australian Copyright Council, under the Free Trade Agreement with the United States, Australia agreed to extend the general duration of copyright. As a result, the rules now are that copyright generally lasts for the life of the creator plus 70 years, and where duration depends on your publication, it lasts until 70 years after it is first published. You'll remember this from the previous lecture and the way that that relates to Disney and Mickey Mouse being at that threat of coming out of copyright. So the basic bottom line and takeaway from this is that you should add it to your work. It's Alt 0169 on a PC or Option plus G on a Mac. It's not available in all fonts. You can write the word copyright as well. And for more information, you can go to the Australian Copyright website, which will help you out. By creating your work appropriately, you will own the copyright and can assert that it's your intellectual property. So that way, if someone tries to steal your work, steal your concepts, you've already got that clear information there. So you can avoid these issues with copycats. However, your work can be used by others in some cases, just as you may use the work of others in some specific cases. There's fair dealing allowed in some instances, and there are special provisions, such as for the uses of research and study, although as we've discussed in this course, that does limit the practical use for what is made, for the purposes of criticism and review, or for parody and satire. There are also instances where things are available as public domain material, and they may be released under certain licenses, for example, Creative Commons attribution. Now, where Creative Commons comes from is this idea of a common, a space that people can move through, perhaps particularly in the British countryside, and that people aren't going to stop you from utilising things in this space. So we now have this idea of a digital commons, a space that we move through collectively on the World Wide Web. So, Creative Commons is a new way of licensing. It's moving away from concepts like copyright or public domain. And essentially, what it does is it gives the creator the choice of what type of licensing they would like that they can then put on their works and determine how it might be reused in the future. It may be that they're very open with the work being reused and no need for crediting. It may be that they're happy for the work to be used in certain ways as long as a profit is not generated from it, or it may be that they're quite specific about those usages. So you can see all of these through different licensing forms. Now, Jones and Hafner present some relevant information on this. So here's some key insights from what they've written. And they talk about it as being a really important way of recognizing new production models. Peer production is collaboration between very large, diverse, loosely organized collections of individuals who are distributed throughout the world and connected by a digital network. The collaborative information production model that makes use of internet technologies to engage vast numbers of individuals distributed across the globe in collaborative projects. And we've looked at this already with some of the examples we've seen about how people are crowdsourcing and creating material in this collaborative way that's been facilitated by technology. There are issues of organisation, review, common goals, and production technology. There are problems of de individuation and virtual distance, which are created in this space, but they do create great new opportunities as well, including things like shifting the way that we approach writing. So we may see sequential writing, parallel writing, and reciprocal writing using new forms such as cloud based technologies. An example of this would be the way that you shared your OneDrive production planning worksheet with your tutor and they can give you feedback via OneDrive. Until very recently, this specific type of collaborative writing was not possible. So there are heaps of possibilities that emerge from commons-based peer production. Jones and Hafner note that individuals do not retain the intellectual property rights to their creative work, but return the work to the commons so that others can use it as well. That's a choice that they can make. And the motivation is fun, a complex combination of people's intrinsic desires to do things that interest them, to interact with like minded people, to show off their talents or intelligence, and to be part of something bigger than themselves. And these types of commons based peer productions work to capitalize on smart groups which show diversity, independence, decentralization, and aggregation. They also rely on collective intelligence. The collective effort is often greater than the sum of the individual contributions that make it up. However, in more complex scenarios, the individual interests of members of the collective need to be regulated by checks and balances, which more often than not place decision making authority in the hands of individuals. So some of the ways that we see this at a practical level can work, things like use of Microsoft Word with track changes, cloud-based documents and edit alerts allow for groups to work reciprocally. We've seen the growth of wikis. So wiki is Hawaiian for quick, and it refers to a kind of website designed to allow its users to quickly and easily create and edit web content. Obviously, Wikipedia is the most successful example of this, having turned into a global encyclopedia, though we have to be very careful about relying on any content from Wikipedia. We've seen the development of open source software such as Linux or Apache, and crowdsourcing works best for modular activities, for example, things like NASA's ClickWorkers project or LEGO Mindstorms, and those with clear purpose and codes, for example, Wikipedia's 5 pillars. And just flicking back to before when I discussed the MEAA, it's the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance. So if you're looking for specific examples of things like journalistic ethics in Australia, MEAA is something to check out. Sorry, that just came to me. Okay, keeping moving forward with our ethical strategies for digital literacy, work to source material ethically and legally. And this week, the tutorials and online content provide some dedicated time to reflect on how you can do this in your digital project. Complete release forms prior to shoot or authoring. These are available on the production resources page and linked from assessments project delivery. So if you have anyone contributing to your work and what they're contributing isn't already available under sort of public domain or Creative Commons license, if you're sourcing that work, then you do need a release form and you'd include that with your final project. Maintain ethical approaches towards talent, language, and product. Ensure that you indicate copyright For example, you can see here how I would indicate it on something I created in 2020. And always credit anyone who has contributed to your project. This is really important professional behaviour, and you'll find that this acknowledgement stands you in good stead. It's often also a good idea if someone has contributed to your project to make sure that they get to see what the final work is. It's really nice to share this with them. They'll see the acknowledgement that you've included in there, and that works to keep that positive cycle going. If you can, it's also a nice idea to allow reviews by contributors where possible. So say when you've got a rough cut done or an early draft, it's nice for them to be able to have a look at what's happening at that stage. Provide evidence of releases or licenses with the delivery of your project, and provide contributors with a with a copy of or link to your finished project, and then contribute back to creative communities where possible. For example, if you've used things that were available under a Creative Commons attribution license, you might think about sharing back your final project under that same license so that others can keep building on the work. Right, now in this next section of the lecture, we're going to turn towards thinking about documentary and truth. Ever since the first documentary, it's been a space for exploring representations of the world. As John Grierson, who's often thought of as one of the grandfathers of documentary, says, in documentary we deal with the actual, and in one sense with the real. But the really real, if I may use that phrase, is something deeper than that. The only reality which counts in the end is the interpretation, which is profound. You can see a still there from the first proper documentary, Nanook of the North, which was created by Flaherty in 1922. Even at that time, the notion of truth was being played with. For example, it was too dark to film inside an igloo, so they had to create a half igloo, which then showed the Inuit people moving around in there, breathing out the steam as they're in the cold air, whereas inside an actual igloo would have been very warm. So there people got the idea that perhaps it was quite cold in an igloo because it had been reconstructed for the purposes of the film. As Wolf Koenig says, every cut is a lie. It's never that way. Those two shots were never next to each other in time that way, but you're telling a lie in order to tell the truth. So whenever we're looking at documentary film, when we're looking at news, when we're looking at YouTube clips which are presenting a notion of truth, we need to think about the way they're constructed. We need to think about where the edits fall and why has that been chosen in this way. We know from our first assignment, the image analysis, that the frame in the image is specifically composed using rules of composition. Why is the edge of the frame there? What are they telling us through things like camera angle and the edit, as well as other mise-en-scène elements? In the reading, it talks about a particularly interesting case study, which is the documentary film Blackfish that came out in 2013. Now, you are able to watch this film via the library catalogue. It's a really interesting documentary and probably the hardest hitting PG documentary I've ever seen. It does contain some disturbing elements, including references to the death of a keeper and violence among orcas. But it is appropriate to watch as a university text due to its strong narrative and focus on ethics, both in filmmaking and animal rights. We won't be looking at it in the course this year, but you are welcome to pursue the topic and to have a look at it yourself. Do be aware, though, that it is a very intense film. What's really interesting about this film, and as is talked about in the reading, is that it created so many issues for SeaWorld. It made them really have to rethink having orcas in captivity, and particularly breeding orcas in captivity, because people seeing this film then reacted quite strongly to the ways in which things were put together. So here, for example, is a news article showing that SeaWorld sees profits plunge 84% as customers desert controversial park because people who loved whales didn't want to support the way the orcas were being treated as shown in the film. However, the director was a bit worried about the response. SeaWorld had quite a strong response, and actually this is a really good example of a film creating real world change. Here you can see the director, Gabriella Copperthwaite, said she didn't expect her documentary to have such strong public impact. It was picked up, and then changes were made. So the removal of breeding whales in captivity, as well as keepers not being placed in the same space as the whales. And we're gradually seeing the phasing out of orca shows and other larger mammals at SeaWorld. So the SeaWorld Orca Show ban, as shown here in this 2016 article, is credited to the work of Blackfish documentary maker. So an example of how films can create significant change. If you have the stomach for it, I recommend watching Blackfish, but I also understand that it is a bit of a hard time at the moment, so I don't encourage you to watch it if um if you're already feeling a bit down about the world. On the plus side though, the doco did create real change and made the world a better place for orcas. Louis Theroux is a really interesting example of a documentary maker who has also created significant change through his well-researched and well-evidenced documentaries. You may have seen these in various formats online or through things like the ABC. The screening that we're going to look at this week is a screening which has Louis interacting with Joe Exotic. Some of you may be familiar with Joe Exotic as he's recently attained fame in the Tiger King series that's been shown on Netflix. Now, Louis actually interviewed Joe almost a decade ago, or about 9 years ago. So he reflects on Tiger King here and discusses the issues that he has with the series. And this article is also linked so that you can read through some more of the details. He says, if I have a quibble with the series, or maybe just a cautionary note, it's that the carnival of human folly it depicts should not blind us to the pressing and less amusing animal issues at its heart. Playthings of a more powerful predator, kept in captivity because of human acquisitiveness, ostentation, and control. In the name of preservation of species, many of the owners I met paid scant regard to actual safeguarding of habitats. The wild, they would say, there's no wild left. Meanwhile, the animals they ostensibly protected and fed and kept penned up were pale smolker of the real thing. Hand-raised tigers are something closer to living taxidermy, deprived of their tiger nature, incapable of surviving outside captivity, living out their days in a state of enforced dependency. And by the way, I've written so far mainly about tigers, though not touched on in Tiger King. The issues around primate captivity, melancholy apes, demented chimpanzees are, if anything, even more troubling, involving as they do creatures of higher intelligence and longer lifespan that are more prone to frustration, lack of stimulation, and mental illness. So we can see the deep thought that goes into these types of series. And this week's screening is the case study. It's about a 50-minute long documentary piece from Louis Theroux on America's most dangerous pets. So he's looking at a very interesting and problematic space, which is the keeping of large animals in the United States. And this works well with our reading for this week, which explores issues around representation and depiction of, particularly in blackfish animals in captivity. So when you're looking at this piece, please have a think about these issues or these questions. What is the story? How is it shot? How are the characters portrayed? So even in a documentary, we see that the different people are portrayed as certain characterizations through editing. So how do we come to know these characters? Here you can see on the left, Louis Theroux, the interviewer, documentary filmmaker, and on the right, Joe Exotic, who's the one who's also been shown now in the Tiger King series, but this was initially him in a piece that Louis Theroux did. Is this documentary balanced? And how could greater balance be achieved? So you might think about those questions. It's always something we strive for when creating media texts, is this notion of balance. Arguably, Louis' work is more balanced than what we might see in the more recent Tiger King. Then the bigger picture questions. What can we learn about ethics and media representation from this piece? And how can media makers strive for ethical representation? So how can watching a piece like this inform our work as media content producers? So that brings us to the end of the spoken part of the lecture. So over the next week, please do keep up those readings. Aim to be more critical of media texts, particularly looking at their construction. Keep working on your project, and the next step for you is to view the lecture screening keeping those questions in mind so you'll be well prepared for the online learning activities and tutorial this week. I hope that you enjoyed the screening. I think it's a very interesting piece and also raises some significant ethical questions.